Greetings everyone, it's Jeremy Sutton here from PrecisionPrinciple.com, and today is day 3 of the 30-day intensive Ashtanga yoga course. So today is Sunday, so we didn't have the physical practice, but we did have our philosophy side of the coin. So today we're going to dive into some of these topics. In particular, today is a pretty exciting day because we're finally transitioning from Indian philosophy, more broadly speaking, into the specific topics that have to do with the yoga practice. But we still have a little bit of transition to go. So we started the day today talking about the 5 main topics that basically Western philosophy and all philosophical traditions have to address. And those are logic, ethics, epistemology, or the science of knowledge, metaphysics or ontology, the idea of what is, and lastly, aesthetics, what is the beautiful. Sometimes these are broken down into the big 3, the good, the true, the beautiful. There's a little bit more granularity here. The main point that was trying to be made is that whereas a lot of time in Western philosophy, we have individuals that jump into specific topics and go very deep into those one topics. Generally speaking, Indian philosophy is trying to address all of those topics in a comprehensive framework. So the word for philosophy in Hindi, I believe, is darshana, and that has to do with sight or vision. And there's the same root in the word vipassana, which happens to be inside sight or vision within, so sort of insight there. And it's important to note that there are many commonalities between the different Indian philosophies. But there's 2 major splits, one major split to make 2 major branches in the orthodox and unorthodox side of the philosophy. Orthodox, in this sense, pretty much means that they are based on the Vedas. They accept the orthodox philosophies of India, accept the authority of the Vedas, and yoga is in that side of the coin. And the unorthodox side, they don't accept the authority of the Vedas, or they are rebelling against the Vedas in some significant way. This includes Buddhism and Jainism, Sikhism as well. So just quickly, the orthodox philosophies of the Indian tradition are, and excuse my pronunciation for all of these words today, if you are offended, I am deeply sorry. But Vedanta, Mementa, Nyoya, Vaishika, and the most important ones for the yoga tradition are Samkaya and Yoga. So Samkaya and Yoga kind of go together. Samkaya is principally the theory of the yoga tradition. This is one of the oldest philosophical schools in the Orthodox, maybe of all of them actually. It's maybe the oldest tradition, the Samkaya. And Samkaya is theoretical, whereas yoga is practical. So sometimes it's said that Samkaya is theoretical yoga, and yoga is practical Samkaya. So Samkaya sort of gives us the roadmap, and yoga kind of tells us how to get there. Is kind of a basic. Now, importantly, all of the Indian philosophies have 6 or 7 common points. At least that was what's told to us today. And so there's a lot of things that actually are in common with the orthodox things like Samkaya and Yoga, and the unorthodox Buddhism, Jainism as well. And so anyone who studied Buddhism to any extent will recognize some of these specific points. And we're going to go over, I'll start by going over these major points of commonality. So the first point is that all of these philosophies, they come from a practical necessity. What do I mean? I mean that they all recognize that an inherent aspect of the human condition is that we suffer. Because we are born, we will experience suffering. We are born, that's a painful experience, though we don't remember it. We all get sick, we all get injured, and we will eventually all die. And so suffering, since suffering is an inherent part of the human experience, we have a lack of ultimate happiness. Most of us don't experience ultimate happiness all the time. So these philosophies have a practical necessity to address this specific problem of suffering. In the Buddhist tradition, we're talking about dukkha. That's the first of the Four Noble Truths, that life is dukkha, life is suffering, it is non-permanence, and so this is the kind of the starting point for all of these philosophies. And the second point, which is shared by these, is that the source of this suffering is basically ignorance. I think the word is avidya in Sanskrit or Hindi. And mostly it's an ignorance of how things actually are. Because we are ignorant of how things are, so we experience suffering. We expect things to last longer than they will, or we hope that they will, but the inevitable truth is that things will fade, we will fade, and so this ignorance is the source of our suffering. And in particular, we have an ignorance of our self-knowledge. We have an ignorance of who we really are. Which brings us to the third point, and that is self-realization. All these traditions share a commonality in that we must come to our legitimate self-realization. And I think we can see this in quite a few texts that essentially our small self, our ego self, our egoic feeling of I am, is basically an illusion. This is the argument made. And this argument is made by many people. I mean, in the present, we have the Dalai Lama. He has a book called Learn to See Yourself as You Really Are, which essentially he leads you through, in that book, he leads you through an experience of sort of trying to realize that your contracted sense of self is an illusion. Whether he's successful or not depends on the person reading the book. Ken Wilber leads us through a similar experience in his book No Boundaries, and also explains the same thing in his book Sex, Ecology, and Spirituality. For those who prefer like the new atheist point of view, Sam Harris has a book called Waking Up. And again, he argues that these traditions are correct in that our small egoic sense of self is an illusion. He points to a lot of brain science that kind of shows that there is no seed of self. If we look for the center of our self in the brain, where is the center of consciousness, we find that there is no actual self-center, but instead we have a bunch of different parts of the brain working together in order to create this feeling that we put together as self. And even Eckhart Tolle, in his The Power of Now, he also talks about this sense of self as an illusion, and that we'll get to this later, but being present is sort of a way to step out of that illusion. So the third point is self-realization, learning to see ourselves as we really are. The fourth common point among the Indian philosophies is, now I think that's pronounced Rita, but essentially comes down to the idea of an eternal moral code, or law of karma. Now, if you don't necessarily believe in an eternal law of moral code or the law of karma, more specifically we have the law of karma in action, or who I am depends on what I do. Who I am right now is a conditioned aspect of reality. Who I am right now has been conditioned by what has happened in the past, and what will happen in the future will be conditioned by what we do in the present. And so this is important because it emphasizes free will, that regardless of what happened in the past, right now I have the free will to decide what I'm going to do. Yesterday we talked about anger management, for example. So if I feel angry, it's up to me to decide how I let those feelings out. Do I lash out and hit somebody, or do I go off to the corner and sulk? Do I sit down and just pour that anger into a creative project to kind of redirect that anger in a more healthy outlet, so to speak? So the point of this law of karma, or this eternal moral code, is that essentially we have the power to control what we do from here forward. And what that does is it sort of liberates us from the bounds of the past. Because if I don't realize that I have free will, then I might look at what's happened to me in the past. I heard a great story the other day. I don't know if it's true or not, but the story is of two twins. And the father was a terrible alcoholic who abused them both. Now, one twin went off and became homeless, alcoholic, living on the street, and when asked, some paper interviewed these two twins and asked, why did you live this life? And he says something to the lines of, well, I had no choice. You see, my father was an alcoholic, he abused me, I am just a product of my past, and this is just how I ended up. Well, the other twin, he ended up extremely successful, very wealthy, and an entrepreneur and a philanthropist. And essentially, they asked him the same question, why, how did you get to this place? And he said, well, I had no choice. I had to be self-determined because I had no help from my past. I had to do everything I could to learn everything I could because, I had no benefits growing up. So, the point of the story is that these two people who ended up going in completely different directions had one major split. One allowed himself to be a victim of the past and to be kind of shackled by what happened previously. And the other said, well, you know what? I was confronted with all these problems in my past, and so now I had no choice but to take life by the horns, to use my free will to sort of direct my life to the place where I am now. So this is the fourth common trait, that we have free will, the ability to take action where we are now, and what we do now will condition what happens in the future. Which brings us to the fifth point, which is the cultivation of self-control, the cultivation of discipline. And in particular, we're talking about the two sides of ourself. That is, if we have self-control, this implies that there are at least two entities inside of our mind. That there is one self that needs to be controlled, or that can be controlled by the other self, and maybe they can actually work either way. But we use the terms lower self and higher self to discuss these two sides of our psyche, and the lower self in particular refers to our instincts, our animal nature. This might be what Freud called the id, the part of us that just wants what it wants, and that's how it is. Yesterday we talked about the move from animal to man to divinity, or from instinct to reason to intuition. And I think here's a more specific explanation of that same topic, because we're talking about our instincts being part of the lower animal self, and that we need to use our reason, our logic, to have self-control and to cultivate discipline over that instinctual nature. And I believe that probably the intuitive nature, intuition, and just simply becoming the thing that we want to become is one of the next steps. So we have the cultivation of discipline and self-control, usually through practice, and the yogic practices are probably going to be explained as the how to cultivate this discipline. The next point is there's a common point of how do we rid ourselves of this ignorance, because we talked about that ignorance is the source of our suffering. So what can we do to rid ourselves of this ignorance? And in this point, essentially, it's described the process of learning anything. This doesn't have to do with just yoga. This could be with engineering, with playing music, or with any activity that we ever learn in our whole lives. And so there's 3 stages of this. The first stage of ridding ourselves of ignorance of any kind is learning. That is, we find someone else, a speaker, a book that's created by someone else, a video, a whatever, in an interaction with a friend. Someone else has knowledge, and we listen to that knowledge. So we start to take that knowledge in. But on the first passing, we sort of have that knowledge, but it's still their knowledge. We're just sort of, parroting back the same thing that the other person has told us. The second stage of the learning comes through contemplation, through self-reflection, and essentially through internalizing the knowledge in our own terms, figuring out what we agree with, figuring out with what we disagree with, and then kind of realizing how that applies to our own life. And then the third stage is from the intuition, from us understanding it, from making it our own, to actually becoming that knowledge, actually putting that knowledge to use, where I suppose this is really where our reason and our intuition start to bridge the gap. And essentially, yoga is the pathway that bridges the gap between our knowledge and our intuition, or our understanding of the knowledge ourselves and our putting that knowledge to actual use. And in particular, we're talking about meditation. Meditation here, sometimes in the deeper sides of meditation, people describe it as the fusion of the subject and the object. Now, the subject is the sense of I am, and the object is anything that I'm looking at. For example, if I'm looking at this notebook, I, the subject, am looking at this notebook. Often it's described in a number of different texts, especially Buddhism, the Yogic tradition, that essentially this feeling that I, this subject, is separate from everything else in the world is an illusion. We talked about that earlier. But through meditation, we can have a fusion of the self and other, what Ken Wilber would describe as no boundary, as in my feeling of self and everything that is. I don't feel a boundary between these two. So this point is that we have a fusion of ourself and everything else, and this kind of creates a feeling of oneness, and supposedly that is the true nature of how we are, following a number of traditions. And then ultimately, all of these Indian philosophies have the common point of moving towards nirvana, of dissolving that the difference between self and other, learning to see ourselves as we really are. And so there's two parts of this nirvana, of this moksha, and there's one, the attainment of enlightenment, but then we continue to live. So this essentially, the Buddha is said to have attained enlightenment at the age of 38, and from that point on to the end of his life, around the age of 80, he lived in this state of, they call, Jivan Multa, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. And that is the living, that your mind is liberated, but will continue to live. And then the second part of that is the Videya Malta, which is essentially after the enlightened person dies, what happens? Well, he exits the cycle of samsara, so now he is an enlightened being in wherever the non-cycle of birth and redeath happens to reside. Unless, of course, in the Buddha tradition, a Buddha is an enlightened one who has gotten rid of who has escaped the circle of samsara, but a bodhisattva is someone who has attained enlightenment, but instead of just exiting this whole cycle, has made the vow to return to earth and continue the cycle of birth and redeath until everybody has also joined in that circle. So, but that's another tradition. So now we start to bring ourselves to specifically, those were the commonalities of all of the Indian philosophies. Now specifically we're starting to enter into the yogic tradition. Now, there is a flow of texts, so to speak, a tree of texts in the Vedic traditions, in the Orthodox philosophies. And so it starts with the Vedas. That's the oldest writings, except they're not really writings because the writing didn't exist until long after the Vedas. But it goes from the Vedas to the sutras, and then from the sutras to the, I'm getting this wrong, but bhashyas, and those are commentaries, so we have like the original text. Then we have each of the 6 Orthodox philosophies has a set of sutras that's specific to it. And then each of those sutras have the next step, which are essentially people commenting on those sutras. And then from those commentaries, we have the treaties, which are essentially the specific topics within those commentaries, within those sutras, which all fall under the branch of the Vedas. So a sutra is a very short set of words that is designed to be with the minimum number of words, but the maximum precision possible. So what's the most I can communicate in the fewest words possible? And in particular, about 2,500 years ago, Patanjali wrote the Yoga Sutras, and there are 195 of these Yoga Sutras. So now we'll go into this first Yoga Sutra. Now I'm sure my pronunciation is terrible, but the first one is Atha Yoga Anushanasanam. And essentially, in English, it is now, the discipline of yoga. These 4 words, 3 words in the original sutra, are extremely densely packed, so it requires some unfolding, which is why the sutras have these commentaries that come after it. But it's significant that the very first word is now. Now, the discipline of yoga. Because this now has several meanings following the line of philosophy. The first one, or the first one we'll talk about, is that now is the time to follow the path of moksha. That is, now is the time to move towards your enlightenment. All of the traditions believe that we can reach enlightenment during this lifetime, that maybe we've had hundreds of lifetimes prior following this philosophy, but this life, in this life, it's possible for us to attain enlightenment. So now is the time to start to pursue this path. Now, we've also talked about presence a little bit previously, and so the other part of now is that we have to bring our mind into the present. Regardless of what we're doing, now is the only time that ever exists. That's the power of now. And it's argued that this is the essence of all spirituality, that it's about full engagement with whatever task is at hand right here. That is, usually we find ourselves task-oriented. That is, if we have a job or a passion that we really like, a sport, a musical instrument, a conversation that we're really into, that we can lose our sense of self while being fully concentrated, being fully in this present moment. And so that's the first part of this now, is that only now is the window, is the gateway, so to speak, to that full engagement, to that loss of self, to that full spiritual experience. And that essentially problems occur when we live in the past, we worry about the future. This is when all our sense of unhappiness or discontent comes from. Because maybe I'm holding on to some baggage from the past. Someone said something to me yesterday, and gosh, it just really made me mad, and I'm still mad about that, and I can't let it go. Or, oh man, I have a test coming up tomorrow, and I'm just so nervous about it. But worrying about what the person said to me yesterday, or worrying about what test I have coming in the future, isn't solving any of my problems, because everything that's happening is happening right now. And so right now is the time to let go of the problem that happened to me yesterday. And right now is the time to prepare for that test that is coming up in the future. So it's all about right now. And this is a very loaded term, but essentially the essence of yoga is to bring your mind into the present, which we're going to come back to that in a second. Because the second part of this sutra is yoga. And the root word of yoga has two meanings. And I'm told that the root word is yuj, Y-U-J. Now, the first meaning is to join. Sometimes it's called to yoke, to bring together. And what we're talking about here is integrating our body, our mind, our soul, if you believe that we have one, but uniting all of these three things into the present moment. That is, integrating all of our being, not letting our personality split off into multiple personalities, which we all do from time to time. For example, while we're watching this video, maybe part of you are listening to the video, and part of you is maybe contemplating what to do after this you get done on the internet, or maybe contemplating, do I even agree with what's being said here? But part of it's listening, part of it's kind of going on in the background, so there's a split in our sense of self. And so the first meaning is to join, to integrate ourselves into one holistic, complete being. But this is also said to be the most common use of yoga. People around the world feel like yoga is to join, and in this class it's argued, he argued that that is not the most correct way to consider yoga. The second way that this YUJ root means is to concentrate. And he argued today that this is the most correct way to understand yoga. And it comes back to the first term, but presence. To concentrate fully in the present moment. Like I said, if I'm playing guitar, I'm simply playing guitar, losing myself into that experience. If I'm in a conversation, I'm simply listening. If I'm speaking, I'm simply speaking. This is also the essence of being in the zone. It's about not letting that kind of thoughtful mind, the lower self, kind of interfere with our present moment. So, if I'm giving a speech, for example, I might think about, oh, everybody's watching me, I'm so nervous, I wonder what everyone's going to think about me. Well, all of those thoughts have nothing to do with simply giving a speech that you know about. All of those thoughts sort of wedge themselves in the middle of this present moment and my state of being. So when we concentrate, we need to be fully engaged with the present moment. And that is the more profound and the more correct way to consider the origin of yoga, following the philosophy of this class. And also it's about experiencing things directly. It's about that voice in our head can essentially label things. So if I'm eating, maybe I'm thinking to myself, this is good, or oh, I only have a little bit left, I hope it's not gone soon, so this is like a source of our suffering. So instead of kind of thinking about what we're doing, this concentration has to do with direct experience. And not only direct experience when we're doing something, but direct experience all of the time. So the essence of yoga is that it's a practice, a physical practice, to cultivate this concentration in everything that we're doing. It's a way that we can practice bringing our mind to the present, to be fully engaged with anything that we're doing. And this is where we've made it today. On a side note, I have written about the same topic, about this presence, and I have a technique or a little reminder that can kind of help us get into the present moment called the game. So if you're interested in kind of a modern take on how we can kind of cultivate this present awareness, cultivate this concentration in anything that we're doing, I would highly recommend checking out precisionprinciple.com. Check out the game. It's a short ebook, just 10, 15 pages, and it has some really good information about how we can start to cultivate this sense of concentration in our day-to-day actions. And that is where we have come so far. This is where we've made it. And so I'd like to thank you again for joining me here, and I hope you join me again. If you enjoy these videos, please subscribe and you'll get the updates as they come out. Check out precisionprinciple.com to get more information on these topics. But in the meantime, keep learning, keep growing, and have a great day, guys. Thank you very much.